we then can turn around, well, why is he being impatient? Why can't he just explain it to me? But then on the flip side of that, that could sound like, oh, why do you need to know everything? Why do we have to go into so much detail? And that's where we get stuck. And that's where conflict happens. That's where relationships start to break down. So if we can take a step back from that, where we really want to be is adapting. So it isn't about, gosh, I've got to make my values and my beliefs the same as the other person, but can I take a step back and perhaps consider the filter that they're looking through? What color sunglasses have they got? How are they seeing the world? And is it hard work? Hell yes, of course it is. Because it's much easier to say, well, this is the way that I see it. But how helpful is that?
How are
Thank
you
you.
today, Amira?
I am really well. It's actually my client day, so I feel like my cup is very full when I work with my one-to-one clients because I love them. Maybe a bit too much, but I love them.
I mean, I saw there's a line somewhere with loving your clients a bit too much, but I don't imagine you've reached that. You strike me as the absolute professional. I mean, for what it's worth, I really enjoy your content. I really enjoy your message. I'm hearing incredible things out there, but you're delivering great seminars and talks, and I just think what you're doing is brilliant. And I love and feel very privileged to get to speak to people like you that are change makers, in my opinion, out there that are really helping people, because communication is a complicated topic, right? And I'm not sure everyone fully knows what's meant by communication, but we're always communicating all the time, whether we like it or not. You know, there's a reason why there's a saying, resting bitch face, for example. You know, so that is a form of communication.
I
You know,
love that. Those
yeah,
non-verbal cues.
there you go, so I think what you're doing is incredible, because I wonder how many amazing things haven't come to fruition because the communication wasn't there, that the
Mm.
right language wasn't being used, or whatever the communication breakdown was. But there is such thing as a communication breakdown, so, and I think you're out there making change in that. So I think it's brilliant, and I think it's brilliant what you're doing. So well done.
I want to say thank you. I don't think I could have asked for a warmer intro or welcome. And as I really have to I've learned how to sit with it and take it on, because the old me would really reject that. Like, oh, no, 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 it's nothing. So I really take it on and I want to say thank you. And I do work really hard. My clients know this, so I'm never going to sugarcoat that. But I think it's really lovely when someone plays it back to you,
Mm,
because I do want to have a change, and it's like my literal driver. Like, if I don't have an impact, I think that's like my biggest fear in life, not having an impact and not being
mm.
able to add value. So just hearing it played back and knowing that it is really beautiful feedback. So thank you.
Yeah, well, you deserve it. It's that simple, and I think what else is evident as well is, I know you have a podcast yourself, and obviously you're gracious enough to come on and be guests on podcasts. And I think you never know who you're impacting with things like podcasts is. But podcasts. There you go.
We got there.
Yeah, you never know who you're impacting. That person might be listening and getting all the help they need, but you might never know. They might never feed it back to you. They might feel a certain way about it that's difficult for them. So I think, not only are you helping the people that that you're helping, you're also helping others as well. And that's why for me, it's so important to have people like yourselves on podcasts, on my podcast anyway, so that you can help with that communication. So, I mean, for those people that might not come across you yet, can you tell people a bit about yourself and your journey so far?
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to start with the present, because whenever I get this question, I'm like, oh my God, it's so vast. So I'm going to start with where we're at and then kind of how we got there. Feel free if you want to go any deeper. So anybody that doesn't know me, that's meeting me for the first time. I work with both my one-to-one clients, beautiful companies and beautiful brands. And yes, the essence of every single thing that we do is how you communicate. So there's three real core pillars in the business, and I've built it out in this way for a reason, and I'm very passionate about the approach I take and why it's bespoke. So pillar one is all about, how do you communicate with yourself? Because no matter what is happening in your life, until we learn to master that, you're going to struggle, or it's going to be really difficult for you to learn how to do it really well in your relationship. So we start with you, and that could be your identity, your motivations, your values, like your culture. It's vast, right? Hence the reason why everything I do is really bespoke. Then the second pillar is, how do you then communicate with others? And again, are we talking about a work setting? Are you a leader? Are you a CEO? Is it about how you communicate with your peers? Is it around those difficult conversations? Is it around avoiding conflict? I cannot tell you, I know we'll probably get into this, but how much I probably sit in the space of conflict and what it is, because so much of it as humans, we want to dismiss and we don't want to acknowledge.
Mhm.
But again, under that pillar as well, how do you communicate with your family and your friends? I think they're two areas that I don't know if we do enough work on. And when we look at friendships, for example, they change, they evolve, they feel like breakups. Like, are we okay to cut somebody off? Are we actually going to learn to have different boundaries in that situation? Like, why does a friendship feel so much like a breakup? And again, with family dynamic, huge. And then also, how do you communicate when you're dating and also in your romantic relationship? So that's kind of pillar two. Pillar three is where I get an eye roll if you're not a believer, but it is about how you communicate with the universe. So, yes, it's all about manifesting, and you're doing it already. So, let's just get a little bit intentional about it and understand, okay, well, that dialogue with the universe, what does that look like? How are you engaging? What are your subconscious beliefs that are literally giving your vibration to the universe? Say, yeah, I do deserve this, or I don't. So, that's very much in terms of how I work now and how the business looks. A little bit about my journey. So I guess before this, immediately, I spent 12 years working in the corporate world, which I feel probably most people know about me now. And in really different roles, but predominantly learning and development, meaning I've been working with people for a while. So this felt always like a really natural, organic progression for me to get to this space. And kind of pre that, I mean, I'm mixed. I always say this if anyone hasn't guessed it now. So I grew up with like two cultures, two religions. And I think it's really easy now for me to trace it back and understand why I do what I do. Like, it's so evident.
Mm.
But there wasn't ever a point where I was like, I'm going to be a coach. From a really, really young age, I remember having like this thing inside of me, like in my chest and my stomach, to know that like I wanted to help people. And I think as I grew, it took on loads of different forms. And like at 16, I decided I was going to go be a lawyer. So I qualified, and then I did all my qualifications, and then I never practiced it. I never actually went to go and get my pupillage, and I was always going to be a barrister. But the underpinning reason for it was to help kids going through care who didn't have a voice. So we're not really that surprised that now everything I do talks about communication. And I think there's certain points in my life where I've seen it break down. It's had a really big impact on kind of the relationships from a romantic point of view that I went into, the things that I entertained. And I was like, nobody teaches us how to actually do this really well. There's so much nuance around it. So can you imagine if I get to help people so they don't have to go through the same mistakes that I made? Like, can we actually imagine what it would be like to have really good, strong relationships with other people, with ourselves? Like, can you imagine going through life feeling good? Like, that's pretty cool. So that's kind of how we've got to where we are.
Oh, there's so much there that I'm gonna ask you about, so stand by. But I just wanna, like, again, it's not me validating you. You don't need my validation. But what I'm saying is that it's so impressive, and I really do admire how much clearly personal work and exploration you've done on yourself. And it just shows that you are authentic when you say your first pillar is work on you, right? Because
Mm,
you are the sort of common denominator within every situation that you encounter. So
yeah.
I mean, you must be really pleased. I mean, I've been on a similar journey, so I think potentially it makes it easier for me to spot it in others. But man, it's some great work. um I love the way that you have those pillars. It seems to me that you're saying that the three pillars there are firstly, one surrounds you as a person,
Yep.
understanding yourself and how you communicate with yourself, how you communicate with other people,
Mm,
and the impact that you can have with your words and actions around other people. And then lastly, what you're saying, and I know you said that there's some people are not open to with the universe, but essentially another way of looking at it is your environment, how you're interacting with your environment and how your environment is impacting you. as well. As somebody that's been has had struggles around addiction, it's so
Mm.
important that my environment is set up to support what I want to do, which is not drink alcohol. You know, if I now have a spirits cupboard and bottles of wine open in my kitchen, my environment's cueing me to behave a different way. So I think it's really important that you bring that in. And I think it's very, you know, anyone that does eye roll, maybe that's part of the problem. You know, your environment is triggering you all the time. You know,
I
so
love that. Yeah. And I think when you say environment as well, it's funny because I guess the word in my head, I always say like it's the world. So the third pillar is how to communicate with the world, and your environment is very much part of that. And like you said, okay, if we're eye rolling, maybe we want to dig
mm,
deeper. But even as well on that, I always say that it hopefully it feels like relief, because if
mm,
you feel that you've got to do everything yourself and that there isn't like a higher power, or you're not being guided, and I always say you don't need to be religious
mm,
to like believe in that or be able to embrace it. Like find words that really fit with you, that feel good. I'm not about one approach for all. I'm really about like what makes you you, and how do we get you to be your best version and communicate in a way authentically and be able to adapt. So if you can tap into something and just know that it isn't all down to you. I mean, for me, when that clicked, I was like, oh, relief. Okay, great. I don't have to have it all figured out. Okay, I don't have to know my next a million steps. Let me just look at the next one. So I love as well that you've taken it from an environment point of view, definitely. Because when we're
yeah.
making changes, we want to embrace our higher version. That is like such an integral part.
Yeah, and I mean, you know, environment, what's that? People, places, things. I mean, this impacts our environment. I was up
Mm.
in the Atlas Mountains in Morocco a few weeks ago, and I climbed the highest point in Morocco. But you know what? And I've got a whole story I'll tell you about another time, I'm sure. But it was epic.
I
I learned.
saw the pictures and I
Oh my
literally was like
goodness.
in awe. I was like, I need a
Oh,
breakdown of this,
it
please.
was hard. It was the hardest thing I ever done. But what, you know, people have asked me about it as an experience. And do you know what? One of the things that I tell them was the most incredible part of that journey. I did not have any phone service. And what was
Mm.
interesting was for 2 days, I was checking my phone and there was never a message. There was never anything, no emails, no notifications, nothing. But for 2 days, I habitually was checking my phone. It took me 2 days to go, I'm going to switch it off. I'm going to put it away. And I didn't think about it again. And you don't realize that that's part of your environment. It's a thing. You know, just like that person that might nag at you and make you feel a certain way, just like that place that you go that makes you feel uncomfortable because it's too noisy or it's too loud on the wallpaper or whatever. That phone is part of your environment. And I knew that, and ironically have said it to clients endlessly, and the hypocrisy of going, oh, it's actually true. You know, but as a coach, I think I do that all the time. I sit there and go, "Oh, Johnny, you need to work on that. You're telling this person, but you need to do this work too." You know, it's quite
It's the
funny to me.
magic of coaching when it
Oh,
comes right back at
yeah,
you.
yeah. It's like an arrow. It's like, okay, whoa, missed that one, but I get the point. Thank you.
Yep,
But
yep. Okay, thanks. I've got that note, like
yeah,
note taken.
but that's the playfulness of the universe, isn't it? It's like if you're open to it, it can be quite playful. It's not that you're failing or doing something wrong or you're this or you're that. It's that little subtle, like, oh, nearly got you again, didn't I? It's like that little playfulness. If you can get to that point with yourself, that's often a better way for me personally to move forward. But one of the other things you said, which I think is really profound, and I want to ask you about it, and it leads on to my next question, which is how would you define communication in 2023? But I want to caveat that by what you just said was um, you don't get taught how to communicate. Now, I think about my kids at school, people that I've known in workplaces, and people are getting told what they should be doing. They're always
Mm.
getting told what's expected of them, but they're never getting taught how to do it. I need you to learn this, but I never taught you how to learn. I need you to
Mm.
concentrate, but I never taught you how to concentrate. I need you to
Yeah.
communicate better, but I never taught you how to communicate better, you know? So it's interesting to me that you say that because I think that's a really valid point that we are not taught how to. And then, but what we do is we pile on the guilt and the shame of, oh, I'm not doing very well at this. Well, you don't know how to do it. And that's why people like you are so important because you're teaching them how to communicate. It's a transferable skill. In everything that you do, communication is pretty helpful, you know? So
Yeah.
I'll go with the question, how would you define communication in 2023?
I'm going to expand on this, but I'm going to say wild because in general, the way that we communicate is there's so much nuance to it. So when you say as well, like I really focus on the how, and I think as well, definitely on any of like the content I put out there in whatever format. And somebody played this back to me the other day and said, Amira, I really enjoy your podcast because I walk away with the practical tools. And I was like, that's my goal, because for a lot of us, we've taken on these behaviors on a very subconscious level from a very young age of whatever was role modeled. So, and it can go one of two ways, and everybody's different. So I'm going to try and weave in as many examples as I can throughout this episode. But if, for example, you've grown up in an environment where your voice didn't really get heard, you then over time have conditioned yourself and therefore then created the limiting belief that either your voice is not important, nobody's going to listen to you anyway, what's the point, like I'm not going to be heard. So walk into either your romantic relationship or walk into a work environment, and then you find yourself in a situation where you can't speak up, and for some people as well, you'll literally feel muted. So I want to take that point first of all, because that's kind of like generically speaking. And then if we apply it in 2023 with the context that we have, there's already no right and wrong way of communicating. There's principles I will always guide people through. And then it's right, let's create your own specific blueprint. Let's see what's working, what's not. And then let's rewrite it so it's a healthy one for you and your world, right? And if we can all tap into that, I promise you, like with my whole entire heart and soul, we're going to be in a better space as a collective as well. So I describe it as wild because it's not just that, right? But let's add technology. Now let's add post-pandemic world that we live in. So we've got some people that genuinely are in spaces where the social anxiety is the highest it's been, because I'm going to go around and be around lots of different people. I don't want to. I don't even know how to operate in that space. What am I going to talk about? I already hated small talk and now it's just magnified. And we've got technology on top of it. And I talk a lot about like your verbal and your non-verbal. And in an ideal world, I love to try and encourage people to say, you want to communicate, then our best optimum beautiful space is going to be face to face. Now, is that always realistic? No. Okay. But what is one of the ways I want you to really try and steer away from as much as possible is written. And that doesn't mean don't ever send a WhatsApp. It doesn't mean don't ever send an email. But in what situations is that going to be more helpful, right? Usually if you need to recall information, usually if you want to come back to it. And somebody had asked me really recently to comment on voice notes, whether I think they're good or how I think they're helpful or unhelpful, whether I think people abuse them, are they too long, what about with people. So one of my friends said to me the other day, if anyone doesn't know this, right, was meeting me for the first time, I am notorious for a voice note. Okay, I love them, absolutely love them. My clients know I love them, my friends know I love them, but there's like etiquette around it as well. The reason why I'm such a big fan of it is, one, it's a personal touch. You can genuinely hear somebody's tone of voice and how they intended the message. If you're receiving a written message, okay, you just left that to interpretation. So you're gonna take that on with whatever filter, whatever you're going through, it's just gonna be amplified. Whatever story you're creating in your mind, if that's a negative one, that message can just add to that, regardless of that person's intention. So gone off on a little bit of a tangent, but the key point on that, in 2023, we are post-pandemic. We are also have so many different modes of communication that I think we sometimes feel like, what's the right way to do it? Should I do this? Should I not? And I know for like one of my friends saying the other day, Amira, I don't like when you send me a voice note because it gives me the anxious feelings. I don't know what you're saying in it. And then it makes me not want to listen to it. And for me, as much as I love a voice note, I really wanted to take that on, yeah, because do I want to encourage or evoke those feelings with my friend? No. And if there's something I can do differently, then I will. Do I like typing out a message? Not really. Will I adapt and do it differently for her? For sure. So wild is because there's no right way to do it, but there are principles. And because we are post-pandemic as well, I feel like we've got half of us feeling like the fatigue of like constantly being online. How do we manage like this hybrid world? And actually, what's the most effective way to communicate in that situation and in that relationship? Long answer, Johnny.
I love that answer, and I love the example you used of voice notes, because I mean, first take WhatsApp for example. That's lawless. At least on at least on Instagram, they give you like 60 seconds. The amount of times people have gone back and realized this. You know, you get like 8 of them in a row where someone's trying to say something, but then you've got WhatsApp where it's lawless, and you pretty much get a podcast from your mate.
Yes.
You know what I mean?
Yes.
It's just like, okay, but what I love that you're pointing out there is, and it goes back to what you said originally about how your experiences flavor your perception of certain things. So when somebody reads a WhatsApp written message, they're late, and you type a
Yes.
message saying, "Where are you?" They're in a frantic state trying to get to you. They hear, "Where are you?" You know, because
Yeah.
that's their mode that they're in at the time. They're stressed. They're trying to get to you. They're a bit amped up. They read your message that says, "Where are you?" You're just thinking, "Oh, where are you? I don't know where you are." But it's coming across to them as, "Where are you?" Like, you know, because of the way they feel. So hearing your voice going, "Hi, where you at? Just wondering if you're doing okay," or whatever, that has the desired impact. That's what you meant to say, you know, but otherwise you're leaving it to the universe to like be interpreted or whatever, or that person. So I think that's a really 2023 example of communication, you know, good example like that.
Thank
um
you. I love
yeah.
that.
No, it's good. It's a good way of putting it, because I mean, I listen to certain podcasts. You know, I listen to a lot of self-development stuff, but my guilty pleasure is the Shits and Gids podcast. I find that's hilarious. And what they talk about is the talk within the WhatsApp group. And how lawless it is, and how stuff get. There's a lot of people in real life that'd get cancelled if their WhatsApp group got put on blast. You know?
Yeah.
So it's just, and again, it's another form of communication. So it's interesting to me that you'd say that. And you talked about principles in there as well, like principles of communication. Are there any sort of like, you know, the next question is, are there any commonalities where effective communication breaks down? So are there principles that you can apply that make for successful communication, but are there principles that communication breaks down on at all times? I suspect they're much the same.
Yeah, beautiful question. And you set this up beautifully, by the way, because you kind of already started answering it for me, which I love,
Sorry.
because there's a no, in literally like the
Yeah.
best possible way. I was like, I don't think this could have flowed any nice any nicer. So I want to kind of start from where you've touched on, and then I'm gonna probably add 2 other areas to it. So in terms of like, where do I see communication breaking down? And I would say it massively stems from a space of where we have different values and different beliefs. And I am going to caveat a lot of what I say, because it's not a black and white situation, and I really want people to go away with like context and then ask it. I hope that after this episode they then like want to inquire and ask themselves, all right, well, what do I do in this situation? Well, how do I show up? Well, what's my perception, my filter? So I would say usually where that communication breaks down, and we get into a situation of conflict, which you won't even realize is conflict, because for most of us, conflict means, I've literally had the most negative words. I've had like, conflict means war. I'm like, okay, if that's what you're walking around with, no wonder it feels so heavy. So
Mm.
conflict is actually just as soon as you shift out of where you're communicating, where things are going well. And it's just usually the most subtle shift. So yes, it usually comes from the space where you're communicating with people who have different values and a different belief system.
Mm.
Now, having said that, that doesn't mean we can only communicate with people with the same values and the same beliefs. That's not what it means. But what it does mean, coming back to your point, Johnny, around perception, is I want everybody to imagine that we are all walking around our day-to-day lives with colored sunglasses on. However, the color sunglasses that we're all wearing are different. And we tend to be drawn to people that are going to be wearing the same color sunglasses as us. Because when you look through the world, when you are communicating, you're doing it through that filter. So whatever those sunglasses are, that's the way that you're communicating. So if people are wearing a similar color, they're going to have, or sorry, if they're wearing the same color, they're likely to have a similar view, a similar perception, and a similar way of communicating. So of course I'm going to be drawn to them as a human, because I want to be validated. I like when somebody does the same as me. I don't want somebody to do it differently, because that challenges me. And then I have to look at myself and wonder, oh, do I want to shift this? Am I wrong? So
Perfect. I love that. Absolutely love that. What a fantastic example. Sorry, I interrupted, but I love that. It's brilliant.
thank you. So I think it's a really beautiful, like practical way to understand then, well, where does the conflict come in? Because if I'm wearing red color sunglasses and someone else has got blue, and then we're going to do a swap, well, no wonder you saw it from that point of view. Well, no wonder you're approaching it in that way. So I'll get into conflict a little bit more. I just want to kind of answer your question fully, first of all. But that's like really, I'd say, the crux of where we break down. And then sometimes, not everybody, but sometimes we then get into the black and white filter, which is the right and wrong. So, well, why can't they just see it like me? And I use my mum and dad. I think they fully know. I probably use them as examples on most podcasts that I talk about now. So it's fully out there, right?
Do you still communicate?
I use them as a really good example because they're actually opposite styles. And so, I mean, I fully say to them, thank you for showing me how not to do it. And they have a huge part in play into why I coach and what I coach, right? And why I'm so passionate about it. Because growing up, I would always be able to see both of their perspectives. And it was never about one of them right or wrong. But where they didn't adapt enough to each other is where your friction comes into play. So, as an example, my mum, when she's communicating, really needs to understand why. Whereas for my dad, he's a lot more focused on like just getting to the point and very much around like, just give me the end goal. Let's focus on moving forward. My mum won't be able to get to that space until she understands why. And then we hit friction, right? So mum's coming from her filter and her color perception and her color sunglasses, and dad's got his. And then we get into friction. And this works in loads of different ways. And I'm just giving one example because there's lots of different filters that we look through. But we then can turn around, well, why is he being impatient? Why can't he just explain it to me? But then on the flip side of that, that could sound like, oh, why do you need to know everything? Why do we have to go into so much detail? And that's where we get stuck. And that's where conflict happens. That's where relationships start to break down. So if we can take a step back from that, where we really want to be is adapting. So it isn't about, gosh, I've got to make my values and my beliefs the same as the other person, but can I take a step back and perhaps consider the filter that they're looking through? What color sunglasses have they got on? How are they seeing the world? And is it hard work? Hell yes, of course it is. Because it's much easier to say, well, this is the way that I see it. But how helpful is that? How helpful is that for you as a human and for your relationships?
Are you sure we're not related? Because like we speak the same language, man. We've definitely got the same colored glasses on, that's for sure. But what I love about that is it's a really good example. And the reason why I feel that's an example, good example, is because when you're talking, what I get in my mind's eye is two people trying to have a conversation about something. But the conversation gets derailed and becomes about the communication, not the thing they're talking about. So the communication breaks down because starts with, I'm trying to tell you this and you're trying to listen, to why can't you just say it quicker? And you've just gone off script. Like you're never going to get to the objective and you're going to feel stuck as a consequence because you can't get past this communication thing instead of the thing you're talking about. And I think that's really important. I wonder how much that happens in communications between anybody, businesses, people, relationships, or whatever. And another thing that came up for me there was, I wonder if what you're talking about is compassion, is realizing that, okay, they do things differently. It's not right or wrong. It's just different. However, I'm going to try and ask questions, not because I'm trying to sabotage you or prove you wrong. I'm trying to ask questions for one purpose: to understand, because that is what we're trying to do when we communicate. You're trying to get your point. I heard something once, is people don't buy knowledge, they buy the way it's communicated. And I just think that's a brilliant, I have a communication style that fits for some people and doesn't for others. And if I understand that, I can adapt, which is, I think, hopefully your point. Unless you're like, no, Johnny, you're way off base, shut up.
No, you've hit like 3 points, and I'm going to kind of just pull them out to like summarize them. So when we talk, compassion is literally the hits the nail on the head. And I was running a team session recently where we were looking at, as an internal team, and then to our external customers, how we communicate and where things not working. And of course, it was breaking down externally because they didn't have it down internally. And actually, what was lacking was the compassion and the empathy. And like I say, it is hard work because we've all got our triggers as well. And we get frustrated or we get annoyed or however, whatever that emotion is. So it's then easy to revert back to old behaviors. And it takes work to then create a compassionate dialogue to also want to stop and pause and think about a response rather than your reaction. So definitely the compassion piece is huge. And then it links so nicely into adapting. And usually this is where I get pushback. And they're like, well, Amira, why do I have to adapt? Right. And I want you to look at it from an authenticity place and also from an adapting place, because the two go hand in hand. And what I love to kind of advocate is for each individual, for all of us, I want us to sit in our space of where we communicate authentically and know when to adapt. And if I had to drill it down to a couple of principles or a couple of things to be aware of, your key points of where you're going to have to adapt are the people you struggle to communicate with the most. And usually we now know that's because you're coming from different filters or different color sunglasses. So yes, we're going to have to dial up and work the hardest to be able to adapt. But if you can ask yourself, why am I willing to do it? Usually maybe it's a business relationship. Do I want this to be rubbish? Do I want this to impact the way I feel and come to work and show up every day? Probably not. Is it my partner? Do I love them? Can I see the good in them? Am I with them for lots of other different reasons? Okay, I'm probably more willing to adapt. And the balance here is knowing when and how to adapt without losing your authenticity.
That's beautiful. My wife and I have this thing that we call a gift of love, and it's when we have to compromise.
Yeah.
We don't believe that compromise is always about 50-50, because that means that in some occasions both of you have lost. Neither of you are happy. So
Love that.
let's say it's 80-20. That means that I'm gonna concede, let's say, lack of a better word, and I'm gonna take the 20. But it's a gift of love. I'm conceding. My reason for doing it is because I love you. That's why I'm doing that. And then what that may encourage, it's not an expectation, but what it may encourage is that she remembers that. And then next time I get a gift of love too. It might not happen. It's not an expectation. I've just put it out there because she's listening. And then we go from there. But it's that idea that there's always a reason to do things. And it's like what you said, you used one of my favorite words earlier, which was helpful. Is it helpful? And it's like, this is where people get into that topic of self-sabotage. It's like, I'm self-sabotaging yourself. No, you have potentially have a willingness to want to be right all the time. It's not about whether you understand. It's about, no, this is my opinion. And if you don't agree with it, you're wrong. Well, two people are going to have different opinions and both be right. It depends on what lenses they're wearing, which is what you're saying, isn't it? And I'm loving the way you're bringing this all together. And even I don't expect nothing less because you're a communication expert, but the way that you're bringing it all together is just so people will understand that. They get it, because what you're trying to work towards is being helpful. Look, we both want the same thing, but we're both coming up from different ways. How can we communicate with each other to get there? Some of it's compromise, some of it's understanding, some of it's maybe trying to understand or be compassionate about a value or a belief. And I like the way I'm a big values and beliefs person. And what I often note in people is I use an example of my mobile, for example. And I say, like, my mobile is the hardware and the software is the iOS, right? And when that thing wants you to update, it will nag and it will nag, but we're busy, we're on our phones all the time. We don't have time to update it, so we ignore it. Very quickly, your app stops working and the phone starts turning itself off and on again. And I think that happens with us as we are the hardware and our software is our value system. And it has to update. When you have children, you can't behave the way you did when you didn't have children, and you have to update. And some people don't want to do the update, and then things start going wrong. And I think that can be evident in communication as well. It's like sometimes you can get attached to a way of thinking, even if you no longer think that way, because you have practiced it for such a long time. It's almost a habitual behavior at that point, But it takes a really willing person to say, yeah, actually, I think I need to change that value system, because it's not easy, is it?
No, it's hard. And as humans, right, we will always want to go back to what feels familiar. What's
Mm,
familiar is not always good. And I love when you said, talked about the habitual side of it, because I love to talk about our blueprint being our communication habits, right? That's all it is, okay? And I guess one of the things I love to bust is probably the thing I hear the most. Amira, it's not part of my personality. I can't change it. I'm
mm.
just not good at communicating. It's nothing to do with your personality. It's nothing to do with your DNA. It's a skill. And yeah, maybe you feel that it's never been part of you, but that's because it's not been honed. That's probably because you didn't see it role model. That's because you don't know how to influence. One of my clients said the other day, we're picking up on something and their strengths. And I said, look how well you've been able to influence. They were like, what? How is that me influencing? And we broke it down and we started to look at those components to say, all right, you've got that skill that you didn't even acknowledge, you didn't even know that existed. And look how naturally you're doing that. So it works in the reverse when we've got those unhealthy communication habits. So, all right, do we shut down? Do we want to avoid? Do we not want to have a hard conversation? Are we going into aggressive? Somebody said to me the other day, I've got two different versions of this. Somebody said, Amir, I'm just so passionate, it comes across as aggression. I don't know how to dial that down. Somebody else said, no, I know I'm aggressive, I just lack empathy. I was like, okay, how's that working for you? I don't think well.
Wow.
So yeah. And
Yeah.
it's my unhealthy communication habit in the past, and I'm always aware of it because I know when it can creep back in, is defensiveness. And I think
Mm.
as well, sometimes people have the expectation that because I'm the communication expert, that is nailed down all the time. No, I just work really hard at it. And I've done it for long enough that those old patterns don't necessarily, they're not part of my day to day. But we've also changed the habits. And I understand, where does that defensiveness come from? Okay, why? And actually, that then helps me have a compassionate dialogue with myself. And then when I practice that with myself, it's also a lot easier to do it with other people.
Yeah, and I think the way that you judge yourself is often the way you have taught yourself to judge others. So if you're not compassionate with yourself, you're going to find it very difficult to be compassionate with others, because it's not a well practiced behavior. It's difficult to do that if you don't know how. I mean, I had a conversation the other day with a client, and well, it was a few months ago now, but they it was really interesting. You'd have loved this. They said to me, "My partner is a terrible communicator." Interesting, because I believe that communication is two ways. Tell me, what do you mean? They were telling me about all of these things where their partner was failing, apparently. And I said, okay, cool. Can you speak Chinese? They went, sorry? I said, can you speak Chinese? They said, no, that's a really weird question. I said, no. I said, I want you to speak Chinese to me right now. And they went, Johnny, I can't speak Chinese. I said, but I really want you to. He said, but I
Mm,
can't. I said, so you're telling me that it doesn't matter how much I want you to, no matter how many times I ask, and no matter how I ask, you can't speak Chinese to me. They said, no. I said, so imagine that's communication. Like,
mm,
you are asking this person, it goes back to what we said before. We're asking this person to communicate, but we're not letting them know how we like to be communicated to. We're just saying communicate better, giving no more information, and I think that's important. I think we have to be curious about
mm,
learning about how other people communicate and what their preferences are. I know that there's certain words, if I say to say my partner or my brother or whatever, that it's going to have a certain impact. Some will make them annoyed and make them feel shame or guilt. Some will make them feel really happy and good about themselves. Depending on what they've done, I will choose my words carefully. But we know this about that,
mm.
and I think that's what's so credible about what you're doing. You're getting into, like you said at the beginning, the nuances of it. It's really important to show an interest in those things, because there's a vast amount of communication that I'm sure is down to you, the choices that you make, the words that you use, but it's also about how to understand how other people communicate too. I feel like that's important.
Oh, I was like, I don't even want to add on that. I said, you summed that up beautifully.
Oh, sorry. But I mean, some of the things that, I mean, we just spoke about it. I mean, the next question was, how important would you say values and beliefs are in concern to effective communication? But I mean, like you've explained that with the lenses, and I think that's a beautiful way to look at it, a really helpful way to look at it. Just thinking of it like that, as like that's just based off of your past experiences and the things that you value and the way that you believe the world is, certain words are going to mean certain things to you,
Yeah,
you know?
definitely. And I think going back to one of your earlier questions around not just when things are breaking down, but like what kind
Mm,
of lends itself to healthy communication, just kind of expand on that as well, because there's a few things I feel like we're alluding to that are
mm,
helpful. Um, Two things is, one is expectations and the other is listening. And I talk about those probably a lot because it isn't about not having any expectations, but definitely within my community, I have my beautiful overachievers. I never say high achiever, overachievers, overthinkers. And so expectations can be very healthy, but unrealistic expectations are not. And then, as you were talking in terms of mind reading and expecting somebody else to know, and talking about your client with the Chinese analogy or being able to speak Chinese, then we don't often actually take a step back to look at what are our expectations. So that's the first thing, like what are they? Then I want you to challenge them and to ask yourself, okay, are they healthy? Are they realistic? Are they unrealistic? And I
mm.
remember clearly one client saying to me, well, I've got high standards and what? I said, okay, well, you're holding yourself to those high standards and I can't see it working that well for you. So how do you, what's the impact on the people around you? So I'm not saying ditch them, but let's actually look at what your expectations are. And then once we've challenged them, all right, have you communicated them to the other person, whoever they are, wherever they are? And I think I've got a client that recently started a new role, and we're really talking about mapping out expectations from the beginning. And also it's helping them not fall back into the unhealthy habits that we're trying to like retrain at the moment. And it's so it's kind of two-pronged there. One is I really want to encourage people to communicate their expectations because we often don't, and
Yeah.
we assume, and especially if we go down the romantic route, well, they should know. Why should they know? Did they grow up in the same way as you? Is it just because you've been together for 20 years? People change, people grow. So that communication as well, I think you said it before as well, but like you're allowed to grow, you're allowed to change. Like you don't have to communicate the same way you did 5 years ago. And then the second part I just wanted to add in is listening, because I am gonna probably be so negative here, but say, generally speaking, as a human race, we are terrible at listening. And I actually hate the phrase active listening because it just sounds so corporate. And it's like, what do I do with that? What do you mean actively listening? Because I didn't turn my ears off and I can't not hear stuff. So what do you mean? And there's just a lot around being able to be present, especially when we talk about the world that we're communicating in now. We are bombarded and we take on the most information we've ever consumed as a human race.
Yeah.
No wonder we're overwhelmed. Like, no wonder our communication then breaks down, or we shut down, or we're trying to find like a way to have some solace and retreat. And everybody is very different, not everybody. So please take that with a pinch of salt. But it then kind of, we can understand why we can't listen and multitask. So,
It's that
okay, well,
compassion again.
yeah.
Yeah.
And leaning into asking questions. You said already, stay curious. Like the power of questions in communicating, whether you're influencing, whether you're understanding, whether you're validating somebody's needs, is like, I think, one of the most underrated tools. So listening is a really huge part of when you're striving for healthier communication. And it's because most of us want to make it about us. But actually, if you can remove that, it will help you have a way healthier dialogue. And then that's how you build trust, connection, and better relationships.
It's just so well said. And so valid. You're absolutely right. I mean, I talk a lot to clients about rigid and fluid expectations. And the way I explain fluid expectations is it's like a stream going downhill and it hits a rock. That's not the end. And it's got
Mm,
infinite patience. It can go under the rock, it can go around the rock, it can go over the rock. It doesn't say the rock's the problem, it just goes around it and it works with it and it goes around it and it's very fluid. And I think we can have expectations, but we can also have expectations of our expectations. And it's like
yeah.
staying fluid instead of rigid, because rigid means right, this is it. But that's more of a boundary. I wonder, when I think about it, it's instead of an expectation, it's more of a boundary. It's just being confused potentially. I don't know.
It was
Sorry.
lovely as you, no, it was lovely as you said it, because that's exactly what was coming to my mind. And I was like, it's a really similar thing around your boundaries are around your needs, like what's important to you. And if you find it difficult to express what your needs are, or you feel that you shouldn't, okay,
Mm,
there's a reason why. So how do we shift that? How do we come out of that? And also a lot as well in terms of like our unhealthy communication habits means reframing our perspective of why we think that we shouldn't be able to do that. So whether I'm working with like a brand or a corporate or a one-to-one, for me it's important to do both, because when you're trying to shift your communication habits, you can focus on the practical, but if we don't also think about like reframing your perspective around it, at some point you're going to revert back. And that's
mm.
not what I'm striving for. I want you to change the behavior in the long term. So let's do the two together so that it works in your favor.
Yeah, you're trying to create that consistent situation where you get the opportunity to practice the behavior. Whereas people get overwhelmed. It's like I used to be a PT, and people would say, oh, I messed up on Friday, so I sacked it off for the weekend. I said, yeah, but there was the perfect opportunity to practice this new behavior, but you didn't take it. And it's like,
Mm,
yeah, but I'd already failed. No, no, no. That was just part of it. It's like with sobriety, people think that, I went sober on the 29th of November, 2020. And people think, oh, Johnny's been sober since then. Like I just decided one day, that's it, I'm going to be sober. And the next day, I just cracked on with it. No, I liken it more to a baby trying to learn to walk. It gets up, it
mm,
falls down, it gets up, it falls down. Two things are happening there. One is they're learning from why they fell down. Two, they're strengthening the muscles for the next time. And
yes.
although I went sober on the 29th, for 2 years, I was flirting with dry January and sober October. And, oh, maybe I won't drink tonight and all this. I'll drive tonight and all that sort of
Yeah.
stuff. And it's all part of my journey. Is it failure? No, it's just all opportunities for learning. When clients fall off the wagon, they know now to not message me, because we're going to break that down and we're going to say, okay, what happened? It's not permission to do it again. What it is that happened. What can we learn from it? Where's
Yeah.
the post-traumatic growth there? How can we move through this and take what's happened and move forward? And then eventually there'll be a day when that is their last drink, but maybe it wasn't that day, and that's all
Yeah.
right. And I think that's similar to what you're saying there, is that you're just making sure that when you're communicating, that you're taking those opportunities to have those hard conversations, to understand what people are trying to say, so that next time you have that skill a little bit more practiced, hopefully.
That
Hopefully.
is the plan. Oh
Yeah.
my gosh, yes. Yeah. Practice, get it wrong. And I say that if I live and breathe this day in and day out, and there are still moments where I like, oh, Amira, you could have done that better, then like give yourself that permission, because for you to change it, you have to be able to practice it for sure.
Mm, yeah, brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. I can't wait to get the feedback from this, because it's just brilliant. I love the way that you translate things. It's a really sort of 2023 way of thinking. Some people use examples and it's like, yeah, my granddad would have used that example. It's like, it's not, sorry, that sounds unkind, but you know what I mean.
Yes.
Anxiety seems to be sort of a huge component towards communication today, and for a lot of the reasons you've discussed, like you're kindly mentioning your client, they're getting anxiety around a voice note and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's not something I'd considered. It's an interesting perspective. But anxiety can keep you silent. It can compel
Mm,
you to apply unhelpful meaning to conversations. And most simply, it's just easier to misspeak, right? If you've got that
mm,
anxiety, you might just get what people call verbal diarrhea or whatever and say stuff and be like, oh no. And I think some people blame that now on things like ADHD and things like that, when actually sometimes it's just easy to do anyway, right? But
mm.
what guidance would you give someone that encounters this?
There's a few things to this. The first thing is, if you're feeling anxious and anxiety is kicking in, then that usually means you're overthinking. And we tend to overthink two things. One thing is about the past, where we're going to ruminate and we're going to play it back again and again in our heads in a very unhealthy, unhelpful way. Ruminating is very different to reflecting. I'm going to like specify between the two in a second. And the other time where that overthinking is kicking in is where you're worrying about something that hasn't yet happened, which is then going to trigger those feelings of anxiousness. So, in terms of being able to, first of all, just differentiate between ruminating and reflecting, is reflecting is, yes, it's a great way of being self-aware. It's a great way for you to look back at that meeting, for example, that you hosted and say, all right, how did I show up with my team? I had a client the other day who said, Amira, I don't think I was professional. I was like, okay, well, let's break that down and tell me what happened. And they did. I said, all right, I think you're actually being quite harsh on yourself. And they said, well, it affected the way I slept for the next 3 days. I was like, okay, right. So there is a difference between you being able to reflect back and say, yes, I could have done something differently. Next time, this is what I'm going to work on, versus you sitting with that and not doing anything with it and doing it for an extended period of time. It's going to affect the way you feel. It's going to drive those anxious feelings. And likewise, if you're doing it about something that's not happened yet. So a few tools I want to say here, because it can be really difficult when you are in the moment.
Mm.
I'm going to give a couple of tools for you, but I also think this is where support is really important, really, really important, because it's not always about you trying to take yourself out of something. And then I'm going to probably apply it a little bit in terms of the examples you gave around it keeps you silent, you don't speak. The first thing is see if you can zoom out and look at the bigger picture, because we all have different filters of our negative self-talk, and I talk a lot about like our internal dialogue because it drives so much of how we communicate. And one of those filters could be to think the worst. So we catastrophize. I never say the word properly, but you get my gist. So we're thinking of the worst, and when we're feeling anxious, that all of that side of it is heightened. So I want you to zoom out and I want you to look at the bigger picture. So for example, when my client shared that they weren't professional and they said one thing in this meeting that they believed was going to absolutely ruin their reputation, we needed to zoom out and we needed to look at the bigger picture. Okay, first of all, how harsh was it about what they actually said? I said, were you violent? Did you swear? Did you throw a chair at somebody? No, none of that. Okay, so actually, what's the worst case scenario here? And play that out. So zooming out, there's kind of two sides of that, is let's take a step back from what's happening, because we're so in it that it's just fueling the anxious feelings and it's driving the overthinking. So what's the bigger picture here? Is that one thing that's happened one of many things? Is it actually we've honed in so much in it that we need to zoom out and think, okay, what else is going on here? Is that really going to impact it in the way that I think it is? And what I often love to do is let's go through the worst case scenario. Let's play it out, because we need to be able to rationalize it. Now, I do really want to appreciate that they are quite difficult tools to do on your own. So I always say, like, have somebody that, or more than one person, that's on your like your board of directors for life. And they're the people that you lean into, that you know when you can't do it because you're stuck in that anxiety, that they can kind of help you do that and zoom out. So that's a really important one. The other thing I want to say as well is being able to, two sides of this actually. One thing I'm going to say is if you feel like the overthinking is kicking in, I want you to go and journal on it. And I want you to start like tracking it. Okay, what triggered it? Is it something that somebody else said? Is it something that you did? Then start to tune in and notice your dialogue. What is your internal dialogue? What are you saying about yourself? So, for example, in that situation, it was, God, I've ruined my reputation. Like, I'm not really that good. People are going to find out that I'm like a fraud. I shouldn't really be doing what I do. So think about what your internal dialogue is saying when you're overthinking and when you're feeling anxious about speaking up or not expressing your ideas. Is it that it's not that important? Is it that I'm going to get it wrong? Because whatever your internal dialogue is, it's your clues to actually understanding, okay, why do I believe that I can't speak up? Why do I believe I can't share my ideas? Do I feel like something's going to happen? And you've talked a little bit around like those feelings of shame and guilt. And sometimes we feel like we shouldn't do something. And somebody shared with me before that, well, I felt, I shouldn't talk about this about my family because it's not mine to share. And when I do, I feel guilt around that. So then that keeps them in a space where they keep a lot of things private. All right, well, how's that impacting their life? They're not willing to be vulnerable and open up. All right, well, how's that impacting a relationship? Not in a healthy way. So one thing links to another. And I know I've like gone in on probably an overload there of tools, but zooming out is really helpful. Go through your worst case scenario, because usually it's not as bad as you think. The other thing is being able as well to like go and journal and write it down. Like give yourself sometimes that space to worry, to overthink, to be anxious. Put a timer on it, and then that's it. Shut your journal and walk away from it and go and do something else. Like that distraction is very helpful. And then I guess last thing I want to say, just to give like the practical side, because that's very much like when you're in it. The other thing I'm going to say is if you're struggling to speak up and you find that you're staying silent, or you feel that you shouldn't say something, or you're scared of saying something wrong, my biggest tip around it is to start really small. So don't think, oh, I'm going to go into that meeting tomorrow and I'm going to lead it and I'm going to like boss it and share all my ideas. Okay, unrealistic. So start small, but where is your space in your life at the moment where you feel comfortable? So with one of my wonderful clients, we were working on this, and they sit down and have dinner with their family every evening, which is a really lovely, enjoyable experience. So we kind of introduced a tool where they have like 2 minutes each and they share ideas. But it's a space that they already feel comfortable, and it was getting them to practice flowing and talking about the things that we were struggling to talk about. So starting small is really important, and doing it in a space where you already feel safe. Once you start conditioning your body, you can then start to test the waters in different arenas, whether it's work, whether it's when you're dating, and then over time it will build. So it feels like a slow process, the way I've described it, but it just depends where your nervous system's at.
Well, not, it does. What that is again, it's just that it's that consistent taking that opportunity to practice that behavior that you want to become good at, because what we practice, we become good at. So it's only serves to say, well, why don't we practice the things we want to become good at and not the things we don't,
Mm.
And what I loved in that as well is your use of the word like comfortable, because I think that's an interesting like trap, isn't it, in some ways, because that comfort is comfortable, but it's not always good for us, and I
Mm.
think with clients I've identified before that everyone always says, oh, I get to this point and then I start self-sabotaging, and I say, is it self-sabotaging or is it self-soothing? Are you going back to behaviors that you are comfortable with but are maybe not helpful, because
Mm.
you're comfortable with that behavior, because you've done it, you've practiced it for a really long time,
Yeah.
so you've become comfortable with it, but it's not helpful. So it's actually not self-sabotage, it's self-soothing. What that offers you is compassion, you know, and I feel like that's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's helpful, I think. And
Definitely the shift, especially as well if you're using self-sabotage and you're like, oh, I'm just sabotaging again, because that phrase as well can become so dismissive.
Mm.
So yeah, you're soothing because there's an uncomfortable feeling that you don't want to feel, right? So speaking up in front of a room of people, I don't know why I keep using that example, but it's no different if you find it difficult to express how you feel to your partner,
Mm.
or if, for example, your friends want to go out and you feel like you say yes, but really you're like, no, I need a time out and I want to stay at home, and you feel like you can't say that, then by saying yes or by staying silent or saying something that you don't really mean, you are avoiding the uncomfortable emotion that you don't want to feel. And that's different for all of us, whether it's rejection, whether it is, oh my God, I'm going to feel left out. Oh my God, they're going to think I'm harsh. They're going to think I'm being nasty. So exactly as you said, you find a different way to soothe that emotion so you don't have to be able to feel it. And I know it went really deep, but they're the things that stop you speaking up. They're the things that stop you being authentic when you communicate. So really important point to kind of take away.
Yeah, I mean, you say you went deep, but this podcast is where we go deep. We like a lot of people that listen to this. I know they this is the way they think. They really want to be helpful to themselves. And what's really being highlighted for me here is that people think communication is about what you say, but and it is, but it's also about how you are being understood. And it's that compassion with that other person to understand that they are understanding what you really mean, you know. And I feel like that's important. I don't know. Did I explain that right? I'm not sure I did.
I'm grinning because if I
Yeah.
had to think of like a definition and like what do we mean by like healthy communication or assertive communication, the goal, this is what I always drill it down to, okay?
Mm,
The goal is you being able to get your message across in the way it was, and that it lands in the way that it was intended. That's the first part,
mm.
okay? And that also, whilst you get your message across in and it lands in the way that you've intended it, you also have enough space to be able to respect and take on someone else's like opinion, message, whatever it is. And that is the space we want to get to. And that is where it feels really good. So you actually set that up so beautifully for me.
Well, that's what I was trying to say, right? Like, come on.
You were there. You were there.
You just
Yeah.
got me over the line. Thank you.
Welcome.
You got my back. I love that. Um,
Always.
so another thing that comes up, and I think you sort of alluded to it earlier when you're talking a little bit about aggression and stuff and how people perceive that, but can you define what's meant by being assertive when you communicate? Because I feel like assertive sometimes gets confused with the word aggressive, and commonly I work a lot with women, and I think that happens a lot more with women than it does men. I think there's, unfortunately and potentially, an expectation that it's okay for men to be slightly aggressive, but then when women are assertive, it's
Mm,
confused with aggression, and they're told that they're acting. This is words that have been passed on to me by other women, that I'm acting crazy, or you're hormonal, or you're
mm,
emotional, and all of those
mm.
things. And that's why there's a, well, not, I don't know this, but it seems to me that that's why there might be a reluctance to be assertive, because you don't want to be hit with that hormonal, emotional rubbish that gets thrown at a lot of women. And this is stuff that's been fed back. Like the women that I work with, I do listen. See,
They're gonna be like, "Thank you, Johnny. Thank you. You're
yeah,
advocating for us."
no,
Now,
it's
it's
true.
a really, really, I'm gonna say interesting question, and I'm probably gonna answer it from maybe two or three different angles. And there's probably a little bit more. I want to do like a little bit more research around this when it comes to gender, because the one thing I probably don't talk about is gender. So I never do like a gender split, and I get so much pushback on it, especially if I'm doing it for like a company in a corporate environment, because of like all the history that's gone around, women in the workplace and how we show up, and equal gender pay. So it's not that I try and get away from it, it's just because I sit on such like an individual level around it. So I think, Johnny, you're spot on, especially feedback from your clients and people that you work with, that there is this difference around how do we approach assertiveness, female versus male, and why, for example, some females are reluctant. So I'm going to come back to that. One thing I'm going to say that you also said that is literally hitting the nail on the head is there is a misconception around what assertiveness is. So I'm going to do a bit of an explanation first of all, because yes, it is very much misconstrued with aggression. And I think that if it hasn't been a very natural way of communicating, then this is where where it can get misconstrued. So think about communicating as a scale, and assertive communication is in the middle. So this is where you feel that you can express your needs, your ideas, your thoughts, your feelings, but equally you can also listen to somebody else's, and you can also take on their perspective, and you can hear it and acknowledge it. That doesn't mean that you agree with it. That's your assertive communication. That's healthy, right? You are doing it in a clear, direct, succinct way. That's what it means. You're not forcing your opinions on somebody else. You don't have to agree with somebody else because you feel that you should. That's assertive, healthy communication. As humans, guys, I want to say that's what we want to strive for. All right. I know we're human. We're going to make mistakes. We won't be able to do it all of the time. But if we can aim for it, that would be great. Now, that's in the middle of our scale. At one side of it, we've then got aggression. Now, the reason why it gets misconstrued is because you're communicating in a very different way. And if you do anything else other than that, you have a belief system that supports you're being rude. Now, aggression, let's just define it, okay? Yes, whilst we can associate aggression with shouting and getting angry, or perhaps like lacking empathy, you can also be aggressive in I don't want to say in an underhand way, but in a less like confrontational way.
Would that be
And
passive
aggression,
aggressive?
gonna come on to that in a second.
Sorry, I shut up.
No, no, don't you worry. You're already ahead of it for us. I love it. But aggression is very much about forcing your ideas onto somebody else. And I had a lovely group session the other day, and this came up. And they were in two different groups. They didn't know that this came up. But one person said, "Well, I've had a conversation today, and I really feel like somebody's been aggressive." And I said, "Okay, well, tell me how it came across." The person didn't shout, they didn't raise their voice, but they were forcing their ideas onto them and making them do something that was gonna like what they wanted to do, that they were forcing them to get them to the outcome that they wanted. That was the aggression. So I'm not saying that you always do it in a really peaceful way, but just get out of the mindset that aggression is only shouting, and that it's more about force.
So is it also an indication that that person's not listening?
Oh,
They're
for
more
sure.
focused on you, because I feel like that happens a lot with, and I'm not going to go there because I think it could be a bad plan. But there are certain topics in the world right now that are controversial, or
Mm,
people have
yeah,
opposing opinions.
yeah,
And one of the reasons I believe that people can't come to any sort of commonality or peace is because they don't want the person to understand, they want them to agree with them,
yes,
you know.
exactly.
And it's like,
Mm,
if you don't agree with me, you're wrong. That's not, and I don't
yes,
think that's what that means. I think it means that you just don't agree, and that, as you reflected upon earlier, um that could be because they have different value systems and belief systems, and all of that's okay, you know. So I feel like that's important. I think that's
yeah.
important.
Definitely. So you like spot on, and it just added to like the aggression piece. So the aggression is very much about force. It's about
Mm.
you're forcing them to think in the way that you think because you believe it's right and you feel like that's the way that you're doing it. A different, which I won't go into it now because it's a whole different podcast, but that's where you step into a space of like learning how to influence, right? If you can influence in a really healthy way, then you're going to help somebody else consider why your idea could be good or why you think about it in that way. So that's a different skill set, but that's actually if you want to take aggression in a negative way and turn it into a positive.
Can I just jump in there? Because I know you've got all these things like ready to go in your back of your mind, but like, it's that difference between influence and persuasion. Like, what's the subtle difference there, do you think?
So I was gonna say influencing and
Yeah,
persuasion go hand in hand.
yeah,
Sometimes I think they're like quite interchangeable words. So I wouldn't massively make a big distinction. I
right.
thought we were going to use another word. I was preempting what you were going to say.
Uh,
Um, so yeah, so influencing
yeah.
and persuading, I think influencing you tend to think about more in like a corporate world,
Mm,
but it's the same effect. Whether you're able to persuade someone also gives the connotation. This is where we get into really like the nuances of
mm.
language. It's persuading someone like, oh, you're trying to get them to come onto your way of thinking.
That's what I was trying to get at. Yeah, is that, like, again, part of that not listening and that aggression over assertiveness is that you're now you're basically taking the back door on sort of, you know, okay, I want you to agree with me, you don't agree with me, so I'm going to act like that's okay, but I'm going to still continue to persuade you anyway.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And if
okay.
that's done or
Mm.
that's overdone, we're going to step into a space of manipulation, which,
Yes, right.
so that's, it's like a lighter version of it.
Yeah.
So that's why I say we want to sit in that influencing space. Very good question. I love that. So the other two communication styles I'm just going to cover off because it will make sense then when we
Yeah.
talk about
Sorry,
assertiveness
I'll shut up.
is no, 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 you
I
already
just
said it.
I love asking questions.
No, but it makes sense as well for you to ask as I'm talking it through.
Right.
Otherwise, we'll divert and we'll go on to something else, and you'll be like, "Oh, it's not relevant now." So it works really well. So the other two styles that are equally as unhealthy are passive and passive aggressive. So passive aggressive is different to aggression because you're doing it in an indirect way. So if you find, and bear in mind, I do want to say these styles are really interchangeable. So please don't feel that you need to box yourself in. And you might notice that you do all five. Okay, but
Mm.
you do them in different situations with different people. Loads of context behind why. But passive aggressive is essentially you feel that you can't be assertive, meaning you feel that you can't express your ideas and your needs and your thoughts and your feelings. And so you do it in a very indirect way. Sometimes it can come across as sarcasm. And I know I've got my people listening that are like, yeah, but Mira, sarcasm is my wit. I personally don't like it. But
It's
it's
suppressed
you,
anger.
yeah, you're doing something in an indirect,
Yeah.
underhand
Yeah.
way because you don't feel that you can actually say it in a clear, succinct, assertive way. So rather than saying, I'm going to think of an example in a minute, I'll come back to it. So that's passive aggressive. And then passive is doesn't necessarily mean that you're being submissive, but the way that you're communicating is you will put your needs last. So you will tend to say yes a lot. These are our people that could perhaps take on too much.
Mm.
And then sometimes you can get to a space of where the frustration kicks in or the resentment a lot further down because you've said yes a lot to things. And your passive communication is really to accommodate other people. So again, not putting your needs first. So if I just full circle back to the question around what is assertive communication, It's you being able to communicate in a really clear, direct, succinct way. And I cannot tell you how hard that actually feels when you don't do it, and how often I see it gone wrong, and how often we then over explain. Because if you're a passive communicator, you're not used to being able to be assertive. And somebody said to me, great question the other day. They said, yeah, but Mira, and they're quite a passive communicator. They said, but if I'm going to be assertive like tomorrow, isn't everyone going to think I'm aggressive and
Mm.
say, well, who does he think he is? Because now he's speaking up for himself. And I was like, it's a great question. First of all, if you're coming from a space of communicating quite passively, it's really unlikely tomorrow you're going to start being massively assertive. So don't worry, you're not going to get to the aggression stage like that. But it's something to be mindful of. And yes, as you change communication style, it's a really good point that sometimes people don't know how to handle that.
So I
So
suppose
something
that
to know.
there needs to be some allowance for people to adapt to your new style of things, because people might make assumptions like, oh, you're all right today. You seem a bit, and it's like, no, it's just different, it's just different. Something that you might be able to help with is that I have a client whom think who feels strongly that that passive aggressiveness is gaslighting. Would you go that far?
Definitely depends how it's being done.
Mm,
There's different levels of it, and passive aggressiveness can come out in different ways. The short answer I'd say is yes, there can be an element. What I don't want people to walk away with from this episode is that anytime anyone's being passive aggressive, it is gaslighting,
that's
because it
my point.
isn't.
Yeah.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
isn't. Can it get to that stage? Yes, for sure. Sometimes somebody could just say an underhand, indirect comment, and then you're
Mm,
like, oh, sassy, right?
mm.
That's very different to
Yeah, yeah,
gaslighting.
yeah.
Very different. And gaslighting as well. And the reason I'm so careful with the language is I talk a lot, and I guess I'm very apprehensive. I don't really like labels. Okay. And I think
Nor do
sometimes as
I.
well, right? And in
Mm,
self-development, generally, we can sometimes get too attached to a label and like, oh, I do this because of this. Okay, maybe, but can we not attach to the label? Because
mm.
one, you get boxed in, and two, you use it as an excuse. So the short answer is it can be. They're not automatic. Passive aggressiveness comes out in loads of different ways. And it could just be a lot less of a like less on the scale. And for example, another way, you don't want to go and have a conversation directly with your friend, so you end up gossiping about them to your other friend because you just want to get your frustration out.
Yeah.
Okay, different to gaslighting.
You don't know this, but you've just offered evidence and support to my argument. That's fine. It's like it's all right. Just I hope you're listening, client. I hope you're listening. I feel like gaslighting is like this buzzword now. And like you say, it does happen, but I think people jump to gaslighting as almost reluctant to say it, but almost like a bit of a get out of jail free card. It's like
Yeah,
if I say gaslighting, then this uncomfortable conversation stops a little bit. That's not to say that gaslighting doesn't happen though, but I think what's really important and you worded it beautifully there, it's not always gaslighting, you know.
yeah,
It's not always. Sometimes it's even simpler than that. Someone's passive aggressive with you because they're just having a bit of a crap day.
mm,
Woke up on the wrong side of the bed. Sometimes you wake up and it feels like the whole world's come to an end. There's absolutely no reason for it. It's just the way you feel today, and your day can change, and that's all right. So I like
yeah,
that. Is that people grab onto stuff. And I love, love, love what you said about labels. I say that a lot because I think they can be very restrictive. They can be
yeah.
very restrictive. And if you tell yourself that, oh, this is just me, this is just, and I think an example for me was when I found out that I had dyslexia, which
Mm.
I just want to say on record, like who decided that's how it was spelled? Come on, I'm dyslexic, help me out. It's not fair. you
That is
know,
a really good point.
yeah, it just is annoying. It's like, why? Where did the Y come from? Stop it. Right. So like, yeah, but dyslexia, and it's like I've known people before, and this is not, I'm not being judgmental. It's just I've known people before that go, I can't do that because I'm dyslexic. Whereas my way of thinking, I believe, is more towards, okay, so what does that mean?
Mm.
What does that mean? Because there's going to be pros and cons with that. But that labeling can be restrictive if you just think, oh, okay, I've got dyslexia, and dyslexia means that I can't do this, this, and this. And it doesn't mean that. It means that it's
Yeah,
just different for you. It's just different for you. And that's important because all of a sudden that thing that you think is off the table is back on the table again, and
yeah.
it's
And we
helpful.
don't Yeah, and we don't want that label to become part of, it's all about identity.
Mm.
And when we can attach ourselves too much to it, then it exactly, it has so much power over what we
Does
can or we
can do.
cannot do. Yeah. And
Yeah.
I've said this, I'm sure if any of my beautiful community are listening to this, they would have heard me say this before. But for so many years, I said, I'm not creative, I'm not an entrepreneur. Okay,
Oh,
cool.
I can
My
tell you
mom.
that's not true. I can tell you that for a fact.
So, and it's funny, right, that you and
Yeah,
I can laugh about
yeah,
that
yeah.
because that was what I had. That was a label that I was like, no, 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 that's not mine. Like, I can't pick that up. So, yeah, of course, it had a massive impact on why I started my business when I did and not before. And although I'm a really big believer of the universe and trusting the timing, it's a good example of where that label or both of those labels were really unhelpful for me.
Yeah, and it harkens back to values as well, as I've seen it with clients where they adopt someone else's preferences as a value. And it's like, well, no, that's their preference. They prefer things this way. That's not your value. That's their preference. And there's a
Mm,
difference. And it's like you can see how people get caught up in that, and it's like uh a limiting belief.
mm,
A member of your family sees a spider, screams. In that moment, if you're young enough, you think spiders are dangerous and scary. And then you grow up
mm.
your whole life being scared of spiders, and actually you're not scared of spiders. You don't like the fact that your mum screamed when she saw it or whatever. It's like I remember my mum told me when I was a kid. This is so underhand, right? My mum told me because she was scared of heights and she didn't want to go up high. She told me I was scared of heights. And it wasn't until I went to Australia and I climbed the Sydney Opera House, sorry, Sydney Bridge, and I'm jumping at the top of the bridge in the see-through bridge. I'm like, I am not scared of heights. I'm okay. But it took that for me to realize, it's just like I've just adopted that as a well, that's a limited belief, not a value, but you get my point, hopefully.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. But
um,
it's those all those subtle things that we absorb without even realizing it and just being aware so you can sense check it.
I feel like that point that you make there is that you just have to go back and revisit that and just make sure that's true with some things.
Yeah,
Some of those behaviors that we do that are unhelpful, maybe one of the first ports of calls is just to check it's true before you run with
yeah,
it. Just make sure that that's actually something that you really think is true and believe. And then then I suppose that would dictate and flavor your sort of the next steps you take, maybe, because if it is true, then there'll be a different set of steps to is actually that's just total rubbish. I don't think that at all, because that's
yeah.
easy.
That's not mine.
Yeah, that's an easy solution. Just give it back to the person that gave it to you.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
putting that down.
Yeah. That's yours. That's your bag, by the way. Just come and get that. Um, I just want to check that you're okay for time. You're right for time for a minute? Yeah, because I've
Yeah,
got a couple more questions. And one of them is, I know you speak a lot about internal dialogue. And I believe as a parent that my external words can become my kids' internal words. So I'm really, really on that with what I say. And very often, like my kids are like cringe because like I'll say something and then I'll pause just to make sure it's what I mean. And they're like, is he frozen? What's happening? Like, Dad, speak. To say. But I mean, how can we change unhelpful internal dialogue?
so I think this is where I probably see people struggle the most. And the reason being is that it's on autopilot. So think
Mm.
about like Alexa playing in the background. You know that she's on and she's playing your favorite tracks, but you wouldn't be able to necessarily like recall the last five tracks because it's just on in the background. So think about your internal dialogue as that. And it isn't all bad. So our internal dialogue is there. We need it. It helps keep us in check. It helps us memorize things, and it's helpful. That's kind of called your chatter, helpful chatter. We all need it, but it's when it steps into that negative space and you get that negative self talk that then kind of spirals out of control that we want to do that differently. So two steps really hard steps, okay, but if you can do this, whoof, you're going to change it. The first thing I would say, and I really try and encourage my clients to do this, is keep a diary for like the next 2 weeks as a bare minimum. Every time you catch yourself saying something negative about yourself, maybe about the world, maybe about other people around you, I want you to catch it, but start with the focus on you. So mine for ages was, I mean, this is one of many things, right? But never going to be able to set up a business because it's not creative enough. or like, I don't know how to run a business, or like, I'm not entrepreneurial. Like, I'm a good doer, but I'm not entrepreneurial. That's just like a real snippet. Okay. So catch what you are saying. Now, everybody's negative internal dialogue has a different tone to it. So I know sometimes for other people, you might have heard it called or referenced your inner critic. The same thing, people have different names for it. The reason I stay away from that is because that voice isn't always critical. It could be mean, it could be unfair, it could be judgmental. So it isn't always critical. Your negative voice will take on a different tone depending on you. So the first thing is keep a diary, catch it. Once you then start to revisit that and you see what are the common things, we have a lot of thoughts in a day. So please don't think I'm expecting you to write down every one, but what are the dominant ones? What are the ones that are the loudest that you keep coming back to? Once you put pen to paper and you can see them, or you've written notes in your phone. When it comes to this work, I'm very much pen to paper because it's got a different impact on you. Then I want you to reframe it. And again, this feels really difficult. And I did it with a client the other day, and they're like, reframe it to what? So you want it to be a little bit more positive than what it is that you're telling yourself. Please don't go for the other end of the spectrum. If you are saying, I'm rubbish at communicating at work, like I'm not assertive enough, or I'm not, let's use a different language, I'm not bold enough at work, therefore I'm never going to be a leader. Okay, I think I've heard that one too many times. Okay, saying I'm amazing and super confident and I'm going to make an incredible leader is not a helpful reframe. So what I want you to do is reframe it in a way that it feels slightly different. I don't want it to feel as big of a jump as that example did. So it could be, I'm learning to speak up and channel how to be assertive at work.
Nice.
And then that over time is going to help. So catch it, reframe it, and then actually, as that negative thought comes into your head, replace it with the reframed one.
This is such a validating conversation because I have these things I call the 4 stages of behavioral change. And the first one's awareness. And I think if you don't know what it is, how can you do anything about it? You just can't.
You cannot.
You just don't know what it is, do you? You're not aware of it. And sometimes, in some occasions, awareness is all you need. Just to know. Just to know, because what awareness does is it offers you choice. You know, because I had a situation with a client a while ago, and they were talking about that they had made a choice, that they had made a decision, but they hadn't, because one of the options they didn't believe would ever happen. So therefore, it was never a choice. You know, and I think that's important, you know, to actually really think, okay, is this actually going to happen? Because it's not a choice then. And then you get disappointed because somebody didn't do something your way, but actually it's because it's not that, it's that you unfairly thought they never would. It's your expectation of it, you know. And also, you know, I say the same thing with self-love. I have a challenging relationship with the word self-love because I think sometimes it gets used, it's another buzzword, and it's like somebody has been practicing self-loathing for 20 years and then you go, you just need to love yourself. Oh, okay, I just love myself then. Actually, I think sometimes even saying to someone to like themselves for some people is a difficult step. What about getting to know yourself? How can you like or love yourself if you don't know yourself very well yet? If you don't know, you know, one of the questions I often ask my clients, what do you do for joy? It always makes me sad. And they go, well, my partner likes this and my kids like that and my best friend does this. No, you, what do you like to do? And they don't know. They don't know. They don't know at all. So you don't know yourself very well at all. And that's okay. It's not a judgment. But how about we start there? Let's get to know ourselves instead of just guilt-inducingly say to ourselves, "There, I'm just going to love myself." No, you're not. You're going to pretend to love yourself, and then you're going to get annoyed that it's not working. You know, so let's start simple. You know. So, have you ever read the book Chatter by Ethan Kross?
Yeah, I love the man so much.
Oh, that book was a game changer. Like,
I'm
loved that book. I really did. Yeah,
waiting for him to say yes to come on the podcast. So we're manifesting that, guys. I've put it out there. All right.
Okay, so I'm gonna pick it back off you. If you get him on, you get him on a podcast, go. You know what, my mate Johnny, he's really nice. Come and see on his podcast.
I'll get us booked in at the same time.
Do your thing. Tell him we're related, right? They'll believe it. It's fine.
All right, deal.
Good. Bet. You heard it here, guys. She has it on there. You don't see me. She let me down.
No, I support. I support. Thank you.
I'm only kidding. I'm only kidding. So another thing I love that you talk about is the shadow self. And I know this is a massive conversation, so I haven't got high expectations because it's going to all take forever. It's another podcast, isn't it? But can you explain to the listeners what you mean when you talk about shadow self and how it impacts us?
Yeah, definitely. I'm going to see if I can sum this up so it's bite-sized and feels helpful. So, in essence, your shadow self is the part of you, which we all have, first of all, that we want to hide. We want to keep it in the darkness. We want to suppress it. And bringing it into the light feels scary. It feels like shameful. It feels bad. We don't want to look at those parts of us. So even now, think about the parts of you that you don't like, right? And for me, at one point, there was many elements for it for me, but one element was I remember somebody commenting and saying, "Oh, you're a real warrior," and I was like, "No, I'm not." And I was so insulted, but it was such a trigger point for me
Mm,
because I always wanted to come across as assured and knew what I was doing. And the fact I was worrying alluded to the fact that I didn't. So, the essence of your shadow self is that you're going to find it very difficult to communicate authentically and be yourself until you've done shadow work and until you can go into what I call the darkness, start to learn how to bring these things out with acceptance so that it forms your whole self. So if we have to think of like a comparison, it's opposites. The world doesn't operate without opposites. So you can't have day without night. And it's the same with your shadow self. You can't have the bits that you love about yourself and that you want to show the world until you learn how to accept the parts of you that feel dark, that feel you don't like them, that feel you wish you didn't have them about you. Until we learn to really start to bring them in, that is what is going to form and create our whole self. And once we have our whole self, we're going to find it a hell of a lot easier to be able to communicate authentically. And the shadow self as well is a really big piece around how you connect as well in your relationships, which of course is then impacting the way that you communicate. So it's a real kind of foundation for me when I work with my clients. Like, let's bring that in. Let's hold the mirror up. And yeah, it's uncomfortable. And yeah, it hurts. We don't need to do it all at once. But sometimes we can just start with one piece of it. All right, how are we embracing that? And the more we do that, the more we kind of work towards having that whole self.
Oh, you explained that just brilliantly. That's lovely. No, you're right. And it's one of the hardest things with the clients because as much as it's not that they don't want to talk to you about that part of themselves. It's that they're not ready to accept it in themselves. It's like I always say to people, nothing is more difficult to accept than the things you don't want to be true. And that's what it is. You
Mm,
don't want them to be true. So you're going to
yeah.
resist that. You're not going to want it to be true. And if I don't talk about it and I don't own it, it's not mine. It's like, but the thing is, once you accept something, and again, it sounds like a contradiction. The first step to changing something, you got I said about the awareness, but there's also the accountability. There's also the
Mm,
acceptance and then the actions that come after that. But that acceptance is hard. If you don't accept it, then you don't own it. If you don't own it, you can't change it. And I
mm.
feel like that's important as well. You know, I said that a lot.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I was going to say as well, quote is Carl Jung, what resists persists. So don't do
Yes.
anything about it. It's going to keep coming back to bite you on your bum.
Mm.
And that one took me a long, long time to learn. So that's my tip there.
Mm. But it's from where I'm sitting, you've absolutely learned it, and that's the other thing about these things as well. I feel like sometimes you learn stuff twice, maybe more than that.
Oh,
I've learned
yeah.
it. Like sometimes I think I've got this thing licked, and I'm like, yeah, 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 this thing's really working, and I realize what's happened is it's just escaping up, snuck around the back door, and it's trying the window. You're
Yeah.
like, oh, great, good.
Like that.
Turns out I
You're like,
haven't got it licked at all. So,
oh.
uh, I've got a question about honesty and communication. Have you got time for that, or should we just because it's been a really long time? I think it's up to you. I'll leave it with you.
Go for it. I'm going
Yeah.
to sum it up in a sentence.
Okay, so how important is honesty and communication, either with yourself or the person you're speaking to?
So, two sides of it. Yes, we want to strive for honest communication. That doesn't mean that you have to share every single thought that goes through your head with somebody else.
Love that.
So, going back to the awareness piece, yes, until you're honest with yourself, which can feel really hard and really difficult, especially when we're not yet at a space to welcome in our shadow self, it can feel hard. But the more you can lean into being honest with yourself, the more you're probably going to shift the way you communicate. And honestly, with other people, I'm going to sum it up as, to a certain degree, in certain situations, not everybody needs to know your deep, darkest thoughts.
Got nothing to add to that. Beautifully said. Well done. I like that. I like that a lot. So last question. Is there anything that you'd like to pass on to people that you feel will help them with their self-development?
It's funny because you've literally just touched on it and you had no idea I was going to say this. The first thing I was going to say is you're never done. Okay. So it's a journey. And yes, the same lessons are going to come back and bite you on your bum. So they will show up in a different way, but don't look at it as a bad thing, because what it usually means is you leveled up your life. And so there's a different way of you approaching that lesson, and that's totally okay. So you're never done. Healing isn't going to look linear. Enjoy the bumps of the road. You're going to hit the same lessons more than once. That's equally okay. But in this quest to be better, to grow, to do things in a different way, and have new tools, please don't lose the joy. Like, you're not broken and you're not here to be fixed.
Well, that was really nice. No, it really was. It's true. Everything you say is true. Everything. And that, well done. Like that a lot.
Thank you.
So I'm going to say, well, let's go with what's next for you and where can people find you just before we close this thing down. It's been like the 4-hour podcast or something. I don't know. I was actually clean shaven when we started.
I hope this is gonna be a really good, useful use of people's time. What is next? Podcast season 4 is launching very soon, so guys, keep your eyes peeled. We're very excited about that. You can come and find me. I hang out on IG most of the time, so at @the_communication expert, or you can hit me up on LinkedIn. It's my name, Amira Mansour.
I want to say thank you so much for your time today. This has been such a lovely conversation. I'm sure that everybody is going to get so much value from this. But most importantly, what I want to just use you as an example, if I could, of somebody who, and it's my opinion, I'm sure it's shared by many, but is hugely successful and effective and has a big impact on many, many people in many different ways. But you're talking about somebody that didn't believe that they could be a business owner. They didn't believe that they're creative, and now look what they're doing. So that is a very shiny example of what's possible. So not only are you educating, you're leading by example, you're role modeling. And I think that's really, really, really cool. So thank you for your time today. And I hope we can do it again in some other way. I think we should talk about boundaries. I'd love to know what you think about that.
We can definitely do that. The biggest thank you for having me on. It's been so much fun.
Yeah, it really has. Thank you.